Chapter 19. Jennifer and Victor rushed into the room and were quickly followed by Jonathan and Kirana. Lucas smiled as he realized everyone had made it through. In his mind, he quickly realized that they had encountered very little resistance as they came, and that there was a very real possibility that they were being intentionally moved by Kappa 16. If his intention had been to seal them in the hatched slave area, Lucas hoped that he had frustrated that plan by blowing the hatch off. "Okay, Lucas," said Sig with a smile. "Your turn to shine." Lucas nodded and thought about the situation. After touching his key, his eyes glowed as he looked around the dome. He pulled out the map that Stephanie had drawn. He got out a pencil and made 30 distinct marks representing positions near the hatch. His eyes stopped glowing as he looked over at Daniel Young. "Doc?" asked Lucas. "Yes," responded Daniel, who seemed anxious to be of help. "Did I correctly notice you had taken one of the stun attachments from an augment guard?" he asked. "That's right," said Daniel enthusiastically as he pulled the attachment out and handed it to Lucas. "Thanks, Doc," said Lucas as he took the device. He gripped the mirrored key about his neck and his eyes began glowing. After a few moments, the glow died down. "Sig," said Lucas, "I'm going to need you to go outside and tear up some of the metal flooring in the hall." Sig lowered his head in disappointment, as he was obviously hoping for a battle assignment. "Victor," said Lucas, "please cover Sig. We're about to get a lot more company. Kirana, you too." Victor and Kirana nodded and accompanied Sig out the door as he began prying up the metal grate that made up the flooring in the hall. "Stephanie?" called Lucas. Stephanie stepped up and took out her pad and paper. "Can you confirm that this dome rests on thick bedrock?" Stephanie nodded and began scribbling on her pad, then handed the sheet to Lucas. "Yes, it was done to prevent any tunneling attempts," Stephanie had written. "Also, you saw my note about the poison gas pockets in the outside layer of this dome, right?" "Yes," replied Lucas, "thank you. That means we won't be able to carelessly blast our way out of this dome without harming the slaves, which we do not plan on doing." Stephanie smiled and nodded, as if to say thank you. "Stephanie, would you, Jonathan, and Jennifer please help preparing the slaves to evacuate?" The prospect of working with Jonathan was all the motivation she needed. She nodded her head excitedly and took Jonathan by the hand as they walked to Natalie. Stephanie began using hand signs again, and Stephanie's mother nodded. The four of them began walking toward the small cement sleeping areas where the rest of the slaves were stationed. "What about me?" asked Lizard. "Come sit down over here," said Lucas. The request seemed very unusual. Lizard had hoped he would be assigned a scouting or infiltration assignment. "You too, Doc," added Lucas. Daniel came and sat down. "Lizard, please face away from us," said Lucas. Lizard narrowed his eyes in confusion, but turned away and sat down. "I need some anatomy information, Doc," said Lucas. Lizard and Daniel turned around in shock. "I need to understand how the arm works." Lizard and Daniel looked at each other. "I could punch you in the face, Lucas," said Lizard. "Would that help?" "Though I hate Lizard's violent tone," said Daniel, "I would have thought you might already be familiar with the anatomy of an arm." Lucas smiled as he grabbed Lizard's left wrist. "Humor me, Doc," he said. Daniel had Lizard roll up his left sleeve and began identifying the proper names of bones and muscles. After a few moments, Lucas interrupted. "How about the nerves?" said Lucas. "And since we're pressed for time, forget about the names, just the locations will do." "You're getting on my nerves," said Lizard with air quotes. Lucas laughed in spite of the bad pun. Daniel began pointing out locations on Lizard's arm and explaining how the brain coordinated the movement of various muscles. Lucas's eyes lit up as Daniel explained the arm. It was a bit unsettling to have such an anxious student, and it was confusing why in a moment when they needed to prepare for a strategy for escape, Lucas was suddenly absorbing medical knowledge. In the meantime, Stephanie rushed between compartments, slapping on walls. Jonathan smiled as he saw how energetic she was, and Stephanie smiled when she noticed his attention. Victor and Jennifer tried to explain that they needed to prepare to leave. The word spread that a breakout was being attempted. Some people muttered to one another and returned to their beds. Others wanted to see who was attempting to stage the rescue. Others immediately gathered the few trinkets they had collected in preparation to leave. "Why bother?" shouted one of the slaves. "Kappa 16 will come after anyone he sees resisting. He sees everything." Stephanie frowned in frustration. She yearned for the power to express what was in her mind. She shook her head and made signs with her hands, but no one understood. She exhaled loudly in frustration. Jonathan decided to help. He grabbed his key and took Stephanie's hand. She jumped with a start, but relaxed a bit when she saw Jonathan's glowing eyes looking into hers. He smiled gently. "What do you say, Stephanie?" asked Jonathan loudly. The sight of him in his white cloak had impressed some, but seeing his eyes glow brightly was something new for the slaves. Some of the older ones pointed at the mirrored key about his neck, and the phrase "divine keys" could be heard being whispered among the slaves. Jonathan saw the mind realm version of Stephanie with a blue glow about her. Now that he was not focused on Kirana, he noticed that Stephanie was quite beautiful. "What do you say, Stephanie?" he repeated. "I say let him come, and let him see," said Stephanie. Her voice was clear and sweet, yet filled with power and conviction. It surprised Jonathan to hear it. "I do not want to see one more person work to produce food they will never eat, make equipment they will never use, or bear a child in love, only to give them up as property of heartless augments." Jonathan turned to face the slaves and repeated the words that Stephanie had told him. Stephanie's eyes grew wide with amazement. It was as though Jonathan had looked right into her heart. She had never felt more impressed by anyone, and she had never imagined the stories that her mother had told her about divine keys would be proven right before her eyes. It was difficult for her to identify all of the powerful emotions she felt at that moment. Natalie had tears in her eyes as she saw her daughter's passion. She had always been worried that life in the compound would turn her daughter bitter. She had always encouraged Stephanie and had been careful never to complain about anything if she could avoid it. She tried to keep her emotions under control, though, as she knew that the difficult portion of their plan was yet to come. The slaves in that area that had doubted her felt ashamed when they saw the man that could speak the mind of the mute. It was not long until they had all begun preparing for evacuation. As the slaves continued to prepare for evacuation, Sig came back into the dome with large sheets of perforated metal. He was surprised to see Lucas flexing and straightening Lizard's arm. Victor and Kirana realized why Sig had the confused look on his face, as they also noticed Daniel pointing out parts of Lizard's arm. "What exactly are we looking at?" asked Kirana. "That's a good question," said Victor. "Don't worry," said Sig enthusiastically. "I'm sure Lucas has a fantastic plan." "A fantastic plan with sheets of flooring?" said Kirana with a frown. Victor chuckled slightly, as he was also unable to make sense of how these elements might combine to help them. "We've got your floor," shouted Sig as he ignored Kirana and held up the sheets of flooring. "Thanks," shouted Lucas as he jumped up and jogged to meet him. "So what is the plan for the floor?" asked Sig. Sig's question was interrupted by a scream over in the slave area. They spun around to see a slave suddenly put on a stunner and zap some of the other slaves. "How did they get in here?" asked Victor. "Sympathizers," said Lucas. "People that turn on their own in the hopes of having slightly less miserable lives." "Despicable," said Kirana as she rushed toward the slaves. The others quickly started towards the disturbance, except for Lucas. "No," he tried to call out. "This is a diversion." Everyone ignored him. He turned around to the hatch, knowing that it would be a perfect opportunity to send in real troops. Lucas's instincts were correct. A dozen uniformed guards had started rushing in. Lucas reached for his gun, but the pursuit was so quick he could not retrieve it in time, and was stunned unconscious. It was not long before the sympathizers had been disarmed by Jonathan, but as soon as they had been dealt with, a more troubling scream echoed. Stephanie recognized it as belonging to her mother. She rushed down to find that several slaves were being held hostage. Her mother was being held by Row 82. She covered her mouth in horror. "Our paths just keep crossing," said Row 82. "Release your hostages, and we will allow you to escape," threatened Daniel, who was furious that the guards had gotten hostages. "Escape?" laughed Row 82. "We came in here. Why would we need to escape? You're not very smart, old man." Several of the guards laughed. "What do you want?" said Victor slowly. Row 82 put his knife blade close to Natalie's throat. "Let me say this first," said Row 82. "If any of you attempt to use your so-called divine keys, you will be responsible for the deaths of these slaves." He pulled the blade slightly, drawing a bit of blood and causing her mother to wince. "Your speed or strength enhancements will not be fast enough to save her." Jennifer froze in place. She had been about to attempt using her key, but decided not to risk the lives of others in case she was not fast enough. "One other request," said Row 82 as he turned to Victor. "Victor Lee, you will use that pistol you were about to draw and shoot the mute slave known as Stephanie Mason. Or I will kill her mother." Stephanie's eyes grew wide as she looked at Victor. He slowly pulled out his pistol and looked at Stephanie. "What assurances do I have that you won't kill her mother anyway?" asked Victor. "You cannot seriously be considering this, Victor," shouted Daniel angrily. Jennifer also raised her eyebrows in surprise. Sig clenched his fists. Lizard licked his lips, still hoping for an opportunity to rush in and stop Row 82. A tear rolled down Stephanie's cheek as she watched her mother in terror. She was willing to die so that Natalie might live, but she had no way to tell Victor. "You can only be assured that if you don't, I will kill her mother," said Row 82 impatiently, "and don't think I will spare her, because we have plenty of hostages." Victor slowly raised his pistol at Stephanie and motioned with his eyes for her to run away. It took her a moment to figure out what he meant. "Do it!" shouted Row 82. Stephanie dived down. Victor quickly fired into the air harmlessly. "She ran!" shouted one of the augments. "Go get her!" shouted Row 82. Stephanie began rushing away as several augments began chasing her. Victor pointed his pistol at Row 82 while Daniel slowly approached. "Stay back, old man," shouted Row 82. Victor positioned himself so that he could have a shot at any of the dozen augments with hostages. "If you execute a hostage, Victor will immediately be able to kill you," said Daniel, hoping to prevent any loss of life. "But if we don't kill someone, you won't take us seriously," said Row 82. He turned to one of the augments. "Kill your hostage," said Row 82. "But I need to survive," said the guard. "I am fit." Row 82 pulled out a pistol while keeping his knife at the throat of Stephanie's mother. "Fine," said Row 82. He shot at the hostage, but to his surprise, the augment's body caught the bullet and slumped down. The hostage ran away to safety, revealing that Jonathan had pushed the augment into the blast. Jonathan's eyes were glowing brightly. "I knew what you were thinking," said Jonathan. Stephanie smiled at Jonathan's impressive defense. "Too bad," said Row 82. "You used your key. She dies." "Careful," said Victor as he walked closer to Row 82 with his gun trained on his head. With Row 82's concentration fixed on Victor, the others acted. Within moments, all the other augments had been separated from their hostages. Row 82 whirled around. Jennifer Cedar saw her chance and activated her key. She carefully slipped Natalie down, avoiding the knife, and pulled her to safety. When Row 82 saw that he had also lost his hostage, he pointed his gun toward Victor. "Your divine keys do not make you as powerful as you believe," said Row 82. "And your augmentations do not make you as fit as you believe," countered Jennifer. In a rage, Row 82 shot the arm attachment of one of the augments close to Victor. Arcing electric bolts flew out of the attachment and zapped Victor. The shock stunned the others just enough to allow Row 82 to rush back to the hatch and make his escape. Stephanie and the other slaves had defeated the augments that had been pursuing her, and she quickly joined Jonathan. Kirana took notice of her proximity and friendliness toward Jonathan and frowned, but remained silent. "Doctor," said Victor, "we better check on Lucas." As the group made it back to where Lucas lay on the ground, several dozen slaves followed. The slaves gasped when they saw Lucas face down in the dust. Daniel rolled him over and checked his pulse. "The dust here hasn't helped his breathing," said Daniel. He pulled out his own mirrored key, and his eyes began glowing. The murmuring from the slaves immediately ended as they watched Daniel place his right hand over Lucas's chest. A moment later, Lucas sat up and screamed. The crowd jumped back in shock. "That really hurt," said Lucas as he breathed heavily. "Sorry, it had to be done, Lucas," said Daniel with a touch of relief in his voice. "I know. Thanks, Doc," replied Lucas. "So, what's next, Lucas?" asked Sig anxiously. "Well, it looks like you prevented the hostage situation, right?" asked Lucas. Stephanie nodded happily. Lucas smiled. "Good," said Lucas. "That was most likely Row 82's idea. Kappa 16 is not in a hurry, so we have some time to set up." "We got the flooring you wanted," said Sig with a smile. "Fantastic," replied Lucas. "I need you to bend the sheets of flooring and tie them together to make a dome." Sig's smile grew slightly less wide as Lucas reached into his pack, grabbed a coil of rope, and tossed it to him. He shrugged and left to do as he was asked. "Now the augments that attacked," continued Lucas, "have we already taken their stunner attachments off?" "No," said Victor as he started back to the unconscious guards. Jennifer followed after him without waiting for instructions. "Lizard, we need to do that quickly," said Lucas. "Would you help him?" "I'm on it," said Lizard with air quotes. He turned and scurried past Victor and Jennifer to begin removing the augment stunners. "Okay, now the rest of us have an unpleasant task, but it has to be done," said Lucas. "The slave compartments should mostly be equipped with plastic tubs that are used as toilets, correct?" "That's right," said one of the slaves. "There's no plumbing in this dome, and we have to carry them to a septic pool about 100 yards on the other side of the sleeping compartments." "They don't want us to have access to metal either," agreed another slave, "so no pipes and no metal bedpans." "Okay, the job is to get at least 60 of these bins," said Lucas, "and 30 of them should be filled with, well, whatever's in the septic pool. Bring all the bins back here, please." Kirana could hardly believe what she was hearing. The slaves looked at one another in confusion, but finally did as they were asked, and headed to the cement sleeping compartments to collect the bins. Jonathan, Stephanie, and Daniel started to follow the slaves, but Kirana put her hands on her hips, determined that Lucas needed to be confronted. "Listen, Lucas," shouted Kirana. "There could be dozens, hundreds of armed guards in this complex, and throwing poop at them or showing them arts and crafts made of the flooring is not going to free these people. I've gone along with some crazy strategies from you before, but you'll have to do better than this. It's not a game, Lucas. While you're learning techniques to massage Lizard's arm, we are running out of time in a dome with no food and no fresh water. We need to defeat Kappa 16, not gross him out." The slaves turned in shock as the beautiful white-cloaked woman towered over Lucas. It was as if all sound in the entire dome stopped in anticipation of how Lucas might respond. Lucas narrowed his eyes and stepped up to Kirana before shouting his response. His voice seemed as powerful as the roar of a lion. "If you think that your menstrual irritability is helping anything, you're wrong," thundered Lucas. "Your lack of understanding does not mean my plan is flawed, Kirana. And if you don't start acting like an adult, so help me, your assignment really will be to fling crap at our enemies." Kirana had never heard Lucas speak so forcefully. In fact, no one had stood up to her like this young boy had. She grasped in her mind for something to say, but her mind kept forcing her back to the question, wondering how Lucas knew about her menstrual cycle. Her face turned red, and she turned around and began walking toward the slave compartments with her head lowered. Jonathan walked over to Kirana, but it only made her feel more ashamed. "Leave me alone," she hissed. Jonathan lowered his head and turned away. Stephanie resisted the impulse to smile as Jonathan returned to her side. It was not long before Lucas had tied the final knot to bind the floor pieces together such that they formed a rough dome with Sig. Sig smiled widely. "What now?" asked Sig. Lucas smiled. "Not yet, but soon," replied Lucas. Sig nodded in understanding, but it was obvious that he was anxious to get going. "What do you want with these?" asked Lizard as he carried a bunch of stunner attachments in his arms. Victor and Jennifer followed, each carrying a pair of stunners. "Just put them on the ground for now," replied Lucas. Lizard shrugged as he dumped his collection on the dusty ground. Victor and Jennifer added their pairs to the pile. Not long after, the slaves began approaching with plastic bins, half of them filled with dark, chunky fluid. Lucas jumped up to help organize the effort. "Okay," directed Lucas. "The full bins need to be put down flat in 3 rows here." The foul-smelling fluid sloshed a bit as the containers were placed. The slaves who were used to the condition seemed unaffected by it, but Kirana and Jonathan both looked as though they were about to become ill. "The empty bins need to be placed upside down over the tops of the full bins," explained Lucas as he took one from a slave and fitted it over the other. The other bins were placed down as Lucas directed, creating what seemed to be plastic bubbles filled with sewage. Lucas reached into his pack and removed a flare. After igniting it, he rushed between the rows of bins and melted the plastic in between the lids of the bins to seal the sewage inside. The slaves seemed just as confused as Kirana had been, and wondered what the use of these sealed containers might benefit them. Nearly all 300 of the slaves had gathered around to see what Lucas was doing as he finished melting the plastic to seal the last bin. Checking his work, he picked up the final bin and shook it. The others stood back in fear and disgust, but no liquid escaped. Satisfied that his seals were watertight, he threw the flare out into the dirt some distance away, where it bounced harmlessly in the dust. "What now, Lucas?" asked Jonathan, who wanted to do something to defend Kirana's point of view. "Hang on, Jonathan," said Lucas as he pulled out a block of explosive clay. Carefully placing small chunks on each container, Lucas moved from bin to bin. "Exploding crap. Great," whispered Kirana to herself. She was still a bit upset at Lucas, but did not want to vocalize her frustrations. She felt a hint of satisfaction as she heard some of the other slaves whispering doubts about this plan to one another. After a few moments, Lucas had concluded installing chunks of explosive clay on each sewage-filled bin. He brushed his hands and stood up confidently. "All right, Lizard," said Lucas. Lizard smiled. "You're up, and starting right now, timing is important." "What do I do?" asked Lizard as he stepped up. Lucas pulled out his map and pointed out 30 spots he had marked on the map. "I need each of these canisters delivered to each of these spots. Do you need the map?" "It would help," said Lizard. Lucas handed it to him and nodded. Lizard grabbed a container and scurried with great speed. The slaves were stunned to see a person move as quickly as Lizard was moving. "Sig, Kirana," shouted Lucas, "you're up." Sig laughed as he stepped up. Kirana reluctantly approached. "Here's the plan," continued Lucas. "I need both of you to follow me. I will point to a spot in the dome ceiling or ground. For the spots on the ceiling, I need you, Sig, to throw the nearby container up as close to the ceiling as you are able. Then, while in the air, I need you to use your rifle and hit the explosive tag on it, Kirana." Kirana shuddered at the idea of raining sewage. "What good would that even do unless—" started Kirana. "Shut up," shouted Lucas, interrupting her. He lowered his voice. "Not yet." Kirana looked up and saw a tiny blinking light on a point on the ceiling. She suddenly understood the strategy, and she felt a mixture of excitement for what this strategy might do to advance their cause, and shame for having doubted Lucas. She decided that he truly was a mastermind, and that they were fortunate to have him in their team. She recalled similar doubts when Sig had invited him to join in the quest for divine keys, and similar shame when he had outmaneuvered augments that had trapped her a few months later. "Sorry. You can count on me, Lucas," she said sincerely. Lucas smiled. "I know," he said. "Let's go." As they turned to one of the canisters that Lizard had placed, Lucas shouted to the others. "Just stay right there now," he shouted. "This shouldn't take too long." The slaves looked at one another, wondering what would happen. When Lucas and Sig got to the first canister, Kirana pulled out her sniper rifle and flipped the safety off. Lucas pointed to a spot on the ceiling, and Sig grabbed the edge of the container, spun around, and hurled it up into the air. The spinning motion kept the explosive clay exposed, which was ideal for Kirana, and she hit it with ease. The dark, thick liquid contents sprayed a large, opaque area on the ceiling. Lucas, Sig, and Kirana were already running to the next target, avoiding most of the disgusting rain of sewage that dripped down. The explosion from the second canister occurred on the ground, and the slaves felt the earth move with the loud blast. They watched as the trio went from bin to bin, painting the 30 various points with thick, opaque sludge. After the first several, even the slaves began to understand the strategy. "He's blocking the surveillance cameras," one of the slaves shouted in amazement. "He can't get all of Kappa 16's cameras," argued another. "He doesn't have to get all of them," Victor pointed out with a smile. "Just the ones that observed the area near the hatch." Each explosion caused an increase in admiration for Lucas from every person who watched. The slaves began to smile as hope filled their hearts. Natalie hugged Stephanie. Stephanie grabbed Jonathan's arm and smiled. He laughed. Victor and Jennifer smiled at one another. Even Daniel gave a grunt of satisfaction. "Brilliant," whispered Daniel. They moved efficiently, and it was not long before the 30th canister had painted a section of ceiling with sludge. They rushed back to the others. "Okay," shouted Lucas. "There will be an augment offensive any moment. Be ready." "How do you know?" asked one of the slaves. "The man that sits and watches everything is going to be very upset when he can't see something," explained Lucas. The slave nodded, agreeing that it would probably provoke action. "Sig, Victor, let's get that dome around the door. The concave side should face them. The convex side should face us." Victor and Sig rushed to hold the metal grate dome up to the section where the hatch had been. Lucas tied it to outcroppings that remained from when he had blown the hatch door off. "All right," shouted Lucas. "Everyone that would like to fight, grab a stunner from the pile." Several of the healthier men and women grabbed stunners. The others hid behind them. "That dome isn't going to protect us from very much," said Jennifer to Victor as she looked at its weak attachment. "They could probably just push that through." "Lucas is guessing that they won't," said Victor with a hint of doubt in his own voice. "Kirana," shouted Lucas, "pick off anyone that comes into your sight. Everyone else with firearms, fire if they break through. Once we defeat this offensive, the slaves need to stay here and defend with the stunners for now. We'll radio you when it's safe to make a run for it." Lucas handed a radio to Stephanie's mother and adjusted its channel. He then pulled out his own radio and began tweaking it. Only a few moments passed before Kirana fired. The sound of her rifle was deafening. Another pair of rounds went off. Then there was silence for several minutes. "Here's the stunner grenade," whispered Lucas. Just as he predicted, the clanking sound of a grenade bouncing echoed through the halls, then bounced against the concave dome and rolled back into the corridor from which it was thrown. The zapping explosion made Sig laugh loudly. "Great idea with the dome, Lucas," shouted Sig enthusiastically. "Jonathan," said Lucas, "they'll send in another rush of men, then we have to go." Jonathan drew his swords. Stephanie smiled as she watched him. She had been sure to get a stunner, as she was determined to go with Jonathan Knight. Just as Lucas had predicted, a large group of augments charged toward them. Kirana began firing rapidly, but Sig and Victor quickly joined in. There were enough of them that they pushed the dome down and began pouring out, but not enough of them to survive the steady and accurate fire from Kirana, Sig, and Victor. When the survivors began using the dead bodies of their fallen augment comrades as shields, Kirana switched to her sword. Lucas rushed up and fired through several of them with his 12-gauge as Jonathan and Kirana began slicing through them. Sig and Victor polished off the remaining augments in the rush. The slaves cheered as Lucas stood confidently. "Okay," said Lucas. "Time to go on offense." He pumped his shotgun, flinging a shell out the side that spun in the air. He turned to the hallway and rushed in. Sig, Victor, Jennifer, Daniel, Kirana, Jonathan, Lizard, and Stephanie rushed after him to the sound of thundering applause.